Hello everyone, today we're going to look at natural selection. Your learning objectives for today are to explain how natural selection can act on generations of organisms to affect their phenotypes and to describe the two types of selection. There's actually at least three types, however you only need to worry about two for your specification. So the first thing I'd like you to try is these are some key terms that you need to know for this topic. However, the key term and the definition do not match here. Okay, so what you need to do is make a list of gene pool, allele, natural selection, and so on, and try to figure out which of these definitions is the correct one. Now, some of them are completely new to you, so you might have never heard of selective pressure, for example, but I know you'd know what an allele is, you should know what a mutation is, you should know what a gene pool is, and the others you can try to figure out. So if you stop the video here and try to unscramble the definitions. Okay, so a gene pool is all of the genes in a population. So if you had a population of 100 cheetahs, all of the genes that they have is their gene pool. If you then import another 20 cheetahs from another location, maybe if it's another zoo, let's say, then you're increasing the gene pool because you're adding more genes to that population. An allele is the variant of a gene, so there's different versions like the blue allele and the brown allele for eye color. Natural selection is the process whereby better adapted organisms are more likely to survive and produce more offspring. Adaptation is the process of change where an organism becomes better suited to its environment. And we looked at physiological adaptations, behavioral and anatomical adaptations last week. Allele frequency is the measure of the relative presence of an allele in a population. And this will become clearer this lesson and over the next few, but it's essentially how common is an allele as a proportion. So if 0 is absolutely none, and 1 is, this is the only allele. If blue eye color had an allele frequency of 1, that would mean everyone in the world has blue eyes, and so that allele frequency, that's the only allele that was available. However, obviously that doesn't happen, and we have heterozygotes. We have individuals who have one allele for brown and one allele for blue. That should be accounted for as well. Mutation, a change in the nucleotide sequence of the genetic material in the organism. And selective pressure is any factor that reduces the reproductive success in a proportion of a population. So anything, and this could be in the environment, that makes some individuals less likely to survive and reproduce. Now, the recipe of natural selection, in simple terms, is to have genetic diversity and then to add some kind of a selective pressure. Okay, so this is all very famous, and Charles Darwin, who you see here, is the person who came up with this theory, so the theory of natural selection. But every population should have some sort of genetic diversity, so that we have even an option so that some can survive and others don't. If everyone's exactly the same, if a disease sweeps through, then everyone's going to die. I'm thinking here of like monocultures on farms. If every single plant is essentially a clone of the other, then if a disease like potato blight comes along, then a lot of the or all the population is completely wiped out. And that's actually what happened with the Irish potato famine, because they were growing a variety of potato, and it was mostly that one variety. So when the potato blight came along, all of the potatoes, or the large majority of them, were unusable. Okay, so we've got genetic diversity, but then some kind of selective pressure, something in the environment that's going to change whether these organisms are able to survive and reproduce. And so that results in these different reproductive success rates. Some individuals can live through the selective pressures, but some can't. Now, if you leave that to happen for generations, I'm talking millions of years for some, in some cases, you will end up with a change in an allele frequency. Okay, I know this seems quite abstract, but let me show you an example. So this is completely a fake example, but let's say we've got a population of bunnies that have white fur, this one here, and we've got a population of bunnies that have different fur. So black fur, this is called a Himalayan fur, white fur, and then a grey. And let's imagine we've got a hypothetical tick that comes along, and this tick, for some reason, is only able to find white fur bunnies. Those are maybe the ones that stand out to him. Okay, so let's say that this tick is deadly, so it bites the white bunnies and this population is completely gone. When it attacks this population, it only attacks the white bunnies still, okay? So this tick is the selection pressure. But because this population had more variety, some of the individuals are able to survive and reproduce. So over generations, the bunny population continues, and it's just that you lose the ones that were not well adapted. So in this case, the white bunnies were lost. And we see a similar thing in bacteria and plants. So if you have a population of bacteria that should be able to be killed with antibiotic, but you have a couple that are resistant, okay, they have a mutation that makes them so that they don't die when you apply an antibiotic. What happens is, if you don't continue your course of antibiotics to try to kill all of the bacteria, or if you have the resistant ones, they will actually start to divide and increase in population, and over generations you end up having a population of this mainly resistant bacteria, which is really difficult to treat. And that's one of the reasons that they tell you not to use antibiotics unless it's absolutely necessary, because what you're doing is you're killing off the bacteria that you can, but you're probably leaving the resistant ones, where here it's only a couple, so maybe they're not causing so much harm. But if you use this antibiotic, and then suddenly you have a population that's mostly resistant bacteria. Okay, so when I say reproductive success, what it means is being able to survive and reproduce. It's just a fancy way of saying that. But this phrase, more likely to survive and reproduce, is really, really key in evolution, and we'll see that in a bit. Now, in terms of selective pressures, that's any factor that reduces this reproductive success in a proportion of a population. Okay, so anything that causes some organisms less likely to survive and reproduce. And that could be things like human influences. It could be things like pollution, for example. It could be disease. It could be environmental conditions like hotter temperatures, which we're seeing due to climate change now. Some organisms are not going to be able to handle that. It could be predation, so it could be that if we had a population of wolves and moose, if we suddenly increase the population of wolves somehow, then obviously that's a selective pressure on the moose. It could be competition just within the same species. Okay, now evolution is one of those questions where it's often worth about 4 to 5 marks, and there's specific wording that you have to use, and it's easy in the respect that if you can memorize it, you can gain some marks, but it's difficult because you have to apply it to a specific scenario. So I'm going to show you the key steps that I would expect you to have memorized by the end of this lesson. However, you also need to be aware that when you use this in an exam answer, you should be referring back to whatever the scenario is. Okay, so it always starts with random mutations in the population producing new alleles. Like you saw on the earlier slides, we need to have genetic diversity. You don't have genetic diversity unless there's some random mutations happening and new alleles being made. Then we might get some kind of change in the environment or a selection pressure, like more predators or disease or whatever it is. This is one of the points that would probably change based on your scenario, because if you were given a scenario, you would say the selection pressure is. Some organisms are better adapted to this environment, and so they are more likely to survive, to reproduce, and pass on these favorable alleles, these alleles that have helped them, to their offspring. Those that are less well adapted will die from predation, competition, food, disease, whatever the selection pressure was. Over time, that means that because you don't have any of these less adapted organisms, you only have the ones that are adapted. Since they are the only ones breeding, over time the population has more of this favorable genotype, and over generations that does result in an allele frequency. And again, let's use an example. This is a real one this time. So these are deer. The average length of deer fur in 1810 was 3.5 centimeters, but by 1960 it's now 2.1, and that's obviously because temperatures have been increasing. So if we were to apply that, we've got the random mutations that produce new alleles. Okay, this is always the beginning. And then we have a change in the environment or selection pressure. Now, if this was an exam question, you would say that the temperature has increased, and that's a selection pressure on the deer. Okay, so some of the ones, that have long fur, it's now too hot for them, so they die. Whereas the ones with shorter fur, the ones who had that allele, are able to survive and reproduce. Okay, so these are the better adapted ones to the environment. They're more likely to survive and reproduce to pass on these alleles to offspring, and the less well adapted, the long-haired ones, will die. Okay. Now, over time, the proportion of individuals with a favorable genotype will increase. And again, we have to refer back to the scenario. In this case, the reindeer with shorter fur. That's the favorable phenotype. And so those are the ones that end up kind of dominating the population. Okay, and over time you have a change in the allele frequency. The allele for short fur is just a lot more frequent than the allele for long fur. Now, interestingly, mutations are not affected by the environment. They are random. This is a big misconception that some people have. They think that mutations are caused by a selection pressure, that if we expose this reindeer to sun, suddenly they're going to start getting these mutations for short fur. That's not true. Mutations are random. They are just occurring no matter what. Obviously, there are some examples that we see now, like smoking and UV light exposure can increase the rate of mutations and cause cancers, but that's what it is that it's the rate of mutation that's affected, not so much whether a mutation is happening. Over time, natural selection results in the evolution of new species. Okay, but really important to remember, random mutations are happening anyway. Some of them are good, some of them are bad. If it happens to be a good one, then great, that's going to get passed on. But if it happens to be a bad one, then the organism might die. Now, I'd like you to attempt it with a different scenario. And we're going to look at plants here. So, in an investigation, the tolerance of to copper ions of the grass Agrostis tenuis was determined. So you've got this grass, you want to see how can it tolerate copper ions. Samples were taken of plants growing in waste from a copper mine and from nearby areas just outside the mine. The mean copper tolerance of plants from the mine waste was found to be 4 times higher than of the plants in the surrounding area. Okay, so they have some plants that grow in copper waste and some plants that do not. They found that the ones that grow in the copper waste were a lot more tolerant to copper. Explain how natural selection could produce a copper-tolerant population in the mine waste. Okay, so if you stop the video here and try it. Okay, so we start with there being genetic variation in the original population, although there are these random mutations creating variation. Copper-tolerant individuals are more likely to survive. Okay, so it means that at the beginning the population had some individuals that were copper tolerant and some that weren't copper tolerant, but those who were more likely to survive since the environment, the selection pressure here, was the presence of copper. These reproduce and pass on their genes to the next generation, and that in the end causes an increase in the copper tolerance alleles. Now, if this was a 5 marker, you would have also gotten a mark for stating the selection pressure. Okay, so you would say that the copper presence is a selection pressure here. Now, there are 2 types of selections you need to be aware of. One is called directional selection, which is where we've got phenotypes that move from being one way completely to moving into one extreme. Or we've got stabilizing selection, where it's not good to be the extreme phenotypes, it's good to be the mean phenotype, but I'll show you what I mean in a minute. So, stabilizing selection, phenotypes closer to the middle of the range are selected for. So whatever the phenotype is, whatever the mid-range is, that would be the best to be. The phenotypes at the extremes, so let's say this is length of, I don't know, tails. To have a short tail is not very advantageous, let's say, because if you're a monkey you can't balance very well, and to have a very long tail is disadvantageous because it means you're using up a lot of energy to drag around this heavy tail. Okay, so these extremes, it doesn't make sense to have them. Those individuals are less likely to survive and reproduce, so actually selection is working for this middle. It's good to have the medium tail. This kind of selection reduces variation, so you end up having more individuals in a population with this mean phenotype. And a really good example is human birth weight. Okay, so we have babies who are born very light, so their weight is below a kilogram here, they tend to have quite high infant mortality, and babies who are born that are too big also have quite high infant mortality compared to the middle. So it's safest for a baby to be within this range. Okay, so most babies are born within this range because they're more likely to survive and survive at this weight. And you can see why this is here. So obviously the very light babies tend to be the premature babies, and some they will require an incubator, and it's they might not have fully developed lungs, and so it's more of a struggle for them to be kept alive. Whereas the bigger babies will not be able to fit through the pelvis when being born. Now, obviously now there's C-sections, so if the baby's too big, then they can just do the surgery and try to get the baby out this way, which you could say technically is maybe messing with natural selection a little bit, because now we're getting more babies that are being born quite big, and so those alleles keep staying in the population, whereas usually they would be selected against. Okay, so now that we've had these medical advances, we're more able to keep the very light babies alive, and we're more able to make sure that the bigger babies are kept alive too. So this example may change over the next years to see, and we can see how many babies are surviving. Okay, now directional selection is where you select for one extreme over the other. So the other extreme is selected against. And so you end up shifting the whole range towards one extreme. And an example of that is neck length of giraffes. So if you imagine the early giraffes had quite short necks, but their offspring, just by chance, just by random mutation, happened to have longer necks, those were the ones that were more likely to survive and reproduce, and so they pass on their genes so that their offspring has long necks as well. Okay, so we've moved away from short necks towards longer necks because that was the advantage. Now, to make sure you understand that, I'm going to give you a few examples, and I would like you to think about what pattern of selection is it and why. Is it stabilizing selection, or is it directional selection? So the first one is, in a wild population of lilies, short-stemmed plants do not receive enough sunlight, and long-stemmed plants suffer from wind damage. And this is stabilizing selection, because we're selecting against the extremes. The short and long-stemmed plants would not survive and reproduce. The medium ones would. This one, dark-peppered moths become more common in industrial environments than these light pepper moths. Okay, this is an example of directional selection because one extreme is favored over the other. Robins typically lay 4 eggs rather than having less or more eggs. That's stabilizing again. If they lay fewer eggs, it's likely that not all of them will make it. Sometimes eggs fall out the nest, or another bird comes and attacks it, or something like a fox comes and gets them. Whereas if you have too many, the bird might struggle feeding all the offspring. So 4 is the perfect amount for robins. Giraffes with longer necks have a selective advantage over those short necks. We used that example already, that's directional. And finally, cacti, which is the plural for cactus, with more spines are eaten by peccaries less often than cacti with fewer spines. Okay, and that's directional again, because if the more of these needles you have, the more protected you are. So you're selecting for one extreme over another. Now, I'd like you to use all that information to try to fill out the following table. So if you stop the video here to fill it in. Okay, so for directional selection, environment tends to be changing. Okay, so there's something in the environment, like in the giraffe example, where trees are really high. It makes sense for giraffes with longer necks to be more successful here. For stabilizing selection, the environment tends to be stable or unchanging. Okay, nothing's really changing. The phenotype that's selected for and against, well, in directional selection, the advantageous phenotype, whatever it is. We don't want to say the longer one or the shorter one because we don't know in a particular scenario. Whatever the advantageous one is, and the disadvantageous one is selected against. For stabilizing selection, the mean phenotype, so that middle one, is selected for, and the extremes are selected against. In terms of the allele frequencies, the allele frequency increases for the advantageous phenotype for directional selection and decreases for disadvantageous phenotypes. And for stabilizing, You have a higher allele frequency for the mean phenotype, since it's becoming more common, and it decreases for extreme phenotypes because those individuals that have them do not survive to reproduce. How is the mode affected? Now, if you remember, mode is the most common number. Here, the mode changes towards the advantageous phenotype. So if you remember your graph, the whole curve shifted. So the most common, the top of the curve, shifted towards one way, whereas here, the mode does not change because we're only reducing the extremes. We're only reducing the sides of the graph. In terms of range, the range isn't affected in directional selection. It just all shifts towards one way, whereas in stabilizing selection, it does reduce because we're getting rid of the extremes. Now let's try an exam question. This is available on Moodle. So I would like you to attempt it, stop the video and attempt each question and then mark along with me. So question number 1, snow geese fly north to the Arctic in the spring and form breeding colonies. Different colonies form at different latitudes. The greater the latitude, the further north the colony is. Okay, so the greater the latitude number, the more north we are. The further north a breeding colony forms, the colder the temperature and the greater the risk of snow. There is a positive correlation between the size of snow geese and how far north they breed. A large size results in snow geese being adapted for breeding in colder conditions. Explain how. Okay, and the 2 marks available here. So have a think. Why does being bigger equal being able to survive colder temperatures? Okay, and there's 2 things you could put. One is they have a small surface area to volume ratio. Okay, the bigger something is, the smaller its surface area to volume ratio. You remember this from when you did the heart and the lungs with Kirsty. Okay, so that's 1 mark, and to get the 2nd mark for it, that means you lose less heat to the environment. If you went along with the bigger geese having more fat, you have to link it to saying that they've got insulation when they are sitting on eggs. Okay, I wouldn't worry so much about sitting on eggs, but for insulation. Okay, so those are the 2 marks. Snow geese are either white or blue in color. The table shows the percentage of white snow geese in colonies at different latitudes at different times over the 40-year period. The blank cells in the table are the years where there were no figures available. Describe how the percentage of white snow geese varies with distance north. Okay, so if you remember from your question stem, the bigger the number, the further north we are. So this is north and this is nearer to the south. And if you look at the percentage of white snow geese, have a think about what you're noticing about the percentage of white snow geese. Okay, and the answer is, the further north you go, or the higher the latitudes, the higher the percentage of snow geese. So here at the northernmost colony, all the snow geese are white. The further north, I accidentally revealed the answer there. But the further north, the greater the risk of snow. Use this information to explain how natural selection might have accounted for the effect of latitude on the percentage of white snow geese. And the answer is, if you covered it up, snow is lying longer, or it melts slower at those latitudes, and so the white geese are better camouflaged in the north. And for the 3rd mark, you have to link that to survival. Okay, so if the white geese are more camouflaged, that means that maybe the predators cannot find them, and so they're more likely to survive and reproduce. To get that last marking point, candidates must explain how survival or reproductive success is affected. So you just have to say, more camouflage, less likely to die due to predators, more likely to pass on their alleles to the next generation. Now, the next question on your thing is also one that I've accidentally revealed the answer for, so I'll just read it for you first. The percentage of white snow geese in these colonies changed over the period shown in the table. Use your knowledge of climate change to suggest an explanation. Okay, and the answer is, snow melts earlier, or snow melts further north, or there's less snow, and so white geese are decreasing because the ones that are white are no longer well camouflaged, or they are at a disadvantage, or the blue geese are now better camouflaged. Okay, so because climate change is occurring, snow is melting faster, and so the white geese now stand out because snow is gone. Snow geese breed in large colonies. Scientists studied the nests in one colony. For each nest, they recorded the day on which the first egg hatched. They also recorded the number of young that survived from the nest. They used the data to plot a graph. Okay, so they had a look at the day when the egg first hatched, and then they had the number of nests, so this is the bars, and the mean number of young surviving. Now your question is, what type of selection do you think this is, and describe the evidence from your answer. Now because we're seeing this characteristic shape, that means that this is stabilizing selection. Okay, do not accept stable, it says. And the evidence is that there are fewer geese at the extremes and most survive from the middle of the range. Okay, so it's not necessarily asking you for reasons. It didn't say explain. It just said describe evidence for your answer. So we don't have very many eggs hatching, or the first egg hatching very early, and we don't have first eggs hatching late. There's a lot of eggs that hatch around the 6 to 8 day mark. Okay, if you could send me the evidence of your work to Moodle by 4:30 today. If you're unable to send it by 4:30 because you're working or something like that, then please let me know via email so that I know when I can expect your work. And I will see you or speak to you after half term. Bye.